Basics. I'm going to use our session from today. Here's my session, okay? Typically, we've been working in Pro Tools in the box where all of our outputs feed the same stereo path. 15 and 16 is what we use typically in here, shows up on the board, the DAW button's pressed. We are not going to do that. We are going to use Pro Tools and the board together to mix down a song in hybrid, where we'll be using the best parts of the console and the best parts of Pro Tools, okay? So we don't need the master fader anymore. So I can just say no output, and it goes gray. Now, the idea is instead of having all of our channels feed a stereo output, every channel is going to feed its own mono output. There's 16 outputs on the back of that converter, and they're normal to the 16 DAW inputs of the first 16 channels of the console. So I can send each channel out its own output, and they'll show up on the console, okay? So, Shift, Option, Command to cascade the outputs. So now 1 goes out of 1, 2 goes out of 2, 3 goes out of 3, and so forth. Right?
It saves a lot of time.
Saves a lot of time. That's why I show it to you. What happened to the pan pots when I did that and switched the output of the channels from stereo to mono?
They're gone.
They're gone because you can't pan them.
Because you can't pan them because it's feeding the mono out. So now our pan is on the console only. Okay? So now if I hit play, take 3 was the gold. And I hit the DAW button on the console, green lights start to flicker and things start to happen, right? I bust my channels. Mix A up, my monitor level up. There's a lot of bleed in that kick drum mic. Here's my drums. Kick, snare, overheads, panning on the console, okay? Now, if you had to recall this, these fader movements on the console will be really hard to recall. And in the professional world, I have to recall shit every day, okay? So I would choose not to move the faders on the console past 0. I'd set them all at 0.
Then move the faders in Pro
And
Tools.
move the faders in Pro Tools because that's recallable very quickly by opening the Pro Tools session. Okay? Turn that key down. Rough mix, right? Did my levels. Now I want to start getting into it. So that kick drum has a lot of bleed in it, and maybe for that kick drum I'll just use the EQ that's in line with it, and all I'd have to do is hit the 500 button, and now this EQ is on my kick drum. Took some boxiness out around 700 hertz. So the mixing stuff I'm gonna breeze through. I'm not gonna talk about EQ and how the EQs work, and like I'm just gonna talk about how to get it on the board, how to get it back in. Okay? So I'm gonna do some EQ. Okay? Analog EQ. My snare drum. Sounds pretty dang good. Maybe my snare drum, I'll use the EQ in Pro Tools and just do a little filtering. And maybe I'll do in Pro Tools on my snare drum. We had a compressor on it on the way in, but maybe I'll add another compressor so I have a little more control in Pro Tools. Okay? Now my overheads. I can press the 500 button and I have my SSL EQs on my overheads. Add a little top end with them. Take a little low end out. With the EQ, without the EQ. With the EQ.
That's cool.
Okay? So now I'm using some of the analog stuff and some Pro Tools stuff. Okay? I might go crazy and make an aux track that's stereo
Reverb.
and set its outputs to 9 and 10. Why not? And because I'm crazy, I'm a crazy guy, I would take outputs 9 and 10 of the Apollo and I patch them to a stereo channel. Stereo channel 1. That's going to be the outputs of my reverb feeding XA. On the aux channel, I will add a reverb. I will choose a bus 1 and 2. I'm going to send some of all my channels to bus 1 and 2. Send a bunch of my drums there. Send some key. Send some guitar. And we'll do something big, like a church. Here's my reverb. It's a digital plug-in, but I brought it out onto the board onto a channel. Okay? Okay?
Yeah. I'm good. I was just so stunned by how cool that was, I lost my balance.
In my in this class, when I did the demo, I had my guitar pedal doing an analog reverb and a Pro Tools reverb, and I had like my guitar pedal and Pro Tools reverb on 2 channels, and used both of them, a real reverb in physical, real world, and a digital one. So I'm using stuff in the box, I'm using stuff on the console, right? I can patch in these compressors on a couple channels from the session. I can patch in, you know, some more of like this EQ I'm not using for anything. And in that case, I'd have to patch it. So let's say this keyboard, right? Which is channel 6. I have to look up there because it's not written on the console anymore. So I can use the insert on channel 6, insert send, to slot input 3, which is the piece of gear. Okay? The insert send or the 500 slot send and return, or the insert send and return, is what channel of the board. The slot, 500 slot input and output, is the piece of gear.
So that'd be the same thing if you wanted to use the compressor?
Yes. So I'm going to use the insert send on channel 6 and send it to the slot input 3. Actually, 2, because that's this EQ not being used on anything. 500 slot output 2 to insert return 6. Now there's the INS button on channel 6, which activates that insert, and now this EQ is on the keyboard. Brought out some presents there. Oh, and I solo isolated my... That's from last week. I solo isolated my reverb return, so anytime I solo an input channel, it keeps that from being cut, so I'm always hearing my channels with reverb, which is pretty cool. And if I wanted to change that, I can hit save, and it's blinking telling me that that's the one that's saved. And I can turn it off.
That is
Now,
really cool.
when I solo, it cuts everything.
Neat.
Okay, but I like having my reverb return solo saved, so that way when I select anything that has reverb on it, I still hear the reverb with the channel. So I'm now using that EQ on the keys, and I've run out of EQs, so now my guitar will have an EQ from Pro Tools, and I'm just going to give it a little high pass filter. Maybe dip out some of that honkiness around 700. Sounds awesome, right? I'm joking, I'm doing this very fast, but you get the idea, right?
It could sound awesome.
The stuff that's the most important, I'm using the analog stuff for. Like my kick, my snare, my keys. The stuff that's not as important, like some filtering and some compression on the snare drum, I'm using Pro Tools plugins for. I'm using reverb in Pro Tools, and I'm using fader movement in Pro Tools. At this point, if the mix was where I wanted it, I'd do any automation for solo rides in Pro Tools, be done with it. Then, the last thing that I would do is use the SSL master bus compressor, which is inserted on the Mix A bus. You turn it on with the button that says comp. Now it's on. As long as the in button is pressed and the comp button is on, it's on.
Where's the comp button?
Right here above Mix A. So comp means compressor on. You can't patch the SSL master bus compressor. It does not show up on the patch bay. It's only inserted across the Mix A bus. It's already set from my last class. So that's with the compressor. That's without the compressor. With the compressor. You're like the top end of the cymbals start to breathe a little bit. They're awesome. I mean, that thing's like a couple grand. They're really nice. They are on the master bus of the SSL consoles that cost $500,000. They're on all, the master buses of even the big brother to this and the industry standard consoles that they've been recording pop music on since the 90s. Same circuit on the master bus.
So that's the real deal.
They kept it in this little guy too, which is awesome. So I'm using stuff in Pro Tools. The stuff from Pro Tools is coming to the board, like in Signal Flow, right? The stuff on the board is being added, and it's all being output to the master bus, Mix A. Now, how the hell do I make that into a 16-bit 44.1 WAV file, right? There is no bounce disk button on the console, right? We used to do this. Take two patch cables. On the patch bay, find Mix Out A left and right. Bottom patch bay, bottom row, right hand side. A, Mix Out A left and right. This is the output of that fader on two cables. We used to take this and plug it into a CD burner back in the day and hit record and hit play. Make ourselves a CD or a tape machine. Record a 2-track. Okay?
We don't do that anymore.
We don't do that anymore, but we have Pro Tools. So I'm going to take Mix A out left and right. I'm going to go to Universal Apollo Input 1 and 2. I'm going to come over here to Pro Tools. Shift Command N for a new stereo audio track. I'm going to call this my foldback. Foldback, layback, same thing, right? That's my foldback track. Its inputs are set to 1 and 2. Its outputs are set to 1 and 2. I need to make sure that I mute that before I hit bounce. Because if it was outputting to 1 and 2, which is where the kick and the snare are going, the mix plus the kick and the snare would show up here, go to the master fader, go back into Pro Tools.
It would sound all sorts
out
of
1
funky.
and 2. It'd be a big feedback loop and it would suck.
So we have to mute the output on that, you said?
So you gotta mute the output whilst you record. I select my song. I would also edit this, right? So it started and ended the way I wanted it to.
But that's what we do before we start messing with the board anyway, so.
Yep. And you hit record. Here's my layback. Recording. I'd also be paying a lot more attention to my levels and the master output level because this is really low, right? So you listen to it as it records. When it gets to the end, you hit stop. Okay?
And you just bounce that.
Now you have a stereo wave 2-track in your Pro Tools session, and you can bounce that out into a 16-bit wave file. That's the feedback I was talking about. Because I was still record enabled, and I just unmuted it. It went through these channels.
So just
out of
a
Pro
nasty
Tools,
loop.
back in Pro Tools, back to the console. Okay?
Ugh.
So you gotta take the record enable off, then you can unmute it. Okay? Now check this out. If I bounce this now, and its outputs are set to 1 and 2, and I set the bounce engine outputs to 1 and 2, what's it gonna bounce?
The feedback?
Well, it's gonna bounce our mix, but it's also gonna bounce the kick and the snare. Kick on the left side, snare on the right side. It's gonna be kick and snare mixed back in with the mix, set to the same outputs. An easy way to get around that is to just change the outputs. Let's use 15 and 16 instead.
Did you change them to something that's not used?
Exactly. And then on all these other channels, just to be safe, I can mute them. And just unmute our track with our full back mix on it. Okay? Come up here, bounce the disc. Make sure it's on interleaved, 16-bit, 44.1. Change the bounce outputs to 15 and 16, which is where I selected that layback track's outputs to go. And I'm going to choose a desktop for an offline bounce. And there it is. And then, before I turn it in,
We listen to it.
like I always do, I give it a play. Listen to that reverb. And that knocking kick drum.
For how quick you did it, it's not an awful mix.
That's the whole process that you would do, but you would spend a lot more time than 30 minutes doing that, right? That's a lot to get through in 30 minutes. You can come over here and swipe the camera by the patch bay. And there's a lot of stuff I didn't use, right? Like you two were here last